This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read and recorded by Betsy Bush. Marquette, Michigan, February 2006. Fishing with a Worm by Bliss Perry. The last fish I caught was with a worm. Isaac Walton. A defective logic is the born fisherman's portion. He is a pattern of inconsistency. He does the things which he ought not to do, and he leaves undone the things which other people think he ought to do. He observes the wind when he should be sowing, and he regards the clouds with temptation tugging familiarity at his heartstrings, when he might be grasping the useful sickle. It is a wonder that there is so much health in him. A sorrowing political economist remarked to me in early boyhood, as a jolly red-bearded neighbor, followed by an abnormally fat dog, sauntered past us for his nooning, that man is the best carpenter in town, but he will leave the most important job whenever he wants to go fishing. I stared at the sinful carpenter, who swung along leisurely in the May sunshine, keeping just ahead of his dog. To leave one's job in order to go fishing, how illogical! Years bring the reconciling mind. The world grows big enough to include within its scheme both the instructive political economist and the truant mechanic. But that trick of truly logical behavior seems harder to the man than to the child. For example, I climbed up to my den under the eaves last night, a sour black sea fog lying all about, and the December sleet crackling against the window panes, in order to varnish a certain fly rod. Now, rods ought to be put in order in September, when the fishing closes, or else in April, when it opens. To varnish a rod in December proves that one possesses either a dilatory or a childishly anticipatory mind. But before uncorking the varnish bottle, it occurred to me to examine a dog-eared, water-stained fly book to guard against the ravages of possible moths. This interlude proved fatal to the varnishing. A half-hour went happily by in rearranging the flies. Then, with a fisherman's lack of sequence, as I picked out here and there a plain snell hook from the gaudy feathered ones, I said to myself with a generous glow at the heart, "Fly fishing has had enough sacred poets celebrating it already. Isn't there a good deal to be said, after all, for fishing with a worm?" Could there be a more illogical proceeding? And here follows the treatise, a defense of results, an apology for opportunism, conceived in agreeable procrastination, devoted to the praise of the inconsequential angleworm, and dedicated to a childish memory of a whistling carpenter and his fat dog. Let us face the worst at the very beginning. It shall be a shameless example of fishing under conditions that make the fly a mockery. Take the Taylor Brook between the roads, on the headwaters of the Lamoille. The place is a jungle. The swamp maples and cedars were felled a generation ago, and the tops were trimmed into the brook. The alders and moosewood are higher than your head. On every tiny knoll, the fir balsams have been refitted and creep down impenetrable to the edge of the water. In the open spaces, the Joe Pye weed swarms. In 2 minutes after leaving the upper road, you have scared a mink or a rabbit, and you have probably lost the brook. Listen, it is only a gurgle here, joining a line, smooth and dark, under the tangle of cedar tops and the shadow of the balsams. Follow the sound cautiously. There, beyond the Joe Pye weed, and between the stump and the cedar top, is a hand's breadth of dark water. Fly casting is impossible in this maze of dead and living branches. Shorten your line to 2 feet, or even less. Bait your hook with a worm, and drop it gingerly into the gurgling crevice of water. Before it has sunk 6 inches, if there is not one of those black-backed, orange-bellied Taylor Brook trout fighting with it, something is wrong with your worm, or with you. For the trout are always there, sheltered by the brushwood that makes this half-mile of fishing not worthwhile. Below the lowered road, the Taylor Brook becomes uncertain water. For half a mile, it yields only fingerlings, for no explainable reason. Then there are 2 miles of clean fishing through the deep woods, where the branches are so high that you can cast a fly again if you like, and there are long pools where now and then a heavy fish will rise. Then comes a final half-mile through the alders where you must wade knee to waist deep before you come to the bridge and the river. Glorious fishing is sometimes to be had here, especially if you work down the gorge at twilight, casting a white miller until it is too dark to see. But alas, there is a well-worn path along the brook, and often enough there are the very footprints of the fellow ahead of you. Signs as disheartening to the fishermen as ever were the footprints on the sand to Robinson Crusoe. But between the roads it is too much trouble to fish, and there lies the salvation of the humble fisherman who disdains not to use the crawling worm, nor, for that matter, to crawl himself if need be, in order to sneak under the boughs of some overhanging cedar that casts a perpetual shadow upon the sleepy brook. Lying here at full length, with no elbow room to manage the rod, you must occasionally even unjoint your tip and fish with that, using but a dozen inches of line and not letting so much as your eyebrows show above the bank. Is it a becoming attitude for a middle-aged citizen of the world? That depends on how the fish are biting. Holing a putt looks rather ridiculous also to the mere observer, but it requires, like brook fishing with a tip only, a very delicate wrist, perfect tactile sense, and a fine disregard of appearances. There are some fishermen who always fish as if they were being photographed. The Taylor Brook, between the roads, is not for them. To fish it at all is back-breaking, trouser-tearing work. To see it thoroughly fished is to learn new lessons in the art of angling. To watch R, for example, steadily filling his 6-pound creel from that unlikely stream is like watching Sargent paint a portrait. R weighs 210. 20 years ago he was a famous amateur pitcher, and among his present avocations are violin playing, which is good for the wrist, taxidermy, which is good for the eye, and shooting woodcock, which before the days of the new nature study used to be thought good for the whole man. R began as a fly fisherman, but by dint of passing his summers near brooks where fly fishing is impossible, he has become a stout-hearted apologist for the worm. His apparatus is most singular. It consists of a very long, cheap rod, stout enough to smash through bushes, and with the stiffest tip obtainable. The lower end of the butt, below the reel, fits into the socket of a huge extra butt of bamboo, which R carries unconcernedly. To reach a distant hole, or to fish the lower end of a ripple, R simply locks his reel, slips on the extra butt, and there is a 14-foot rod ready for action. He fishes with a line unbelievably short, and a Kendall hook far too big, and when a trout jumps for that hook, R wastes no time in maneuvering for position. The unlucky fish is simply derricked, to borrow a word from Theodore, most saturnine and profane of Moosehead guides. "Shall I play him a while?" shouted an excited sportsman to Theodore after hooking his first big trout. "No," growled Theodore in disgust. "Just derrick him right into the canoe." A heroic method, surely, though it once cost me the best square-tail I ever hooked, for Theodore had forgotten the landing net, and the gut broke in his fingers as he tried to swing the fish aboard. But with these lively quarter-pounders of the Taylor Brook, derricking is a safer procedure. Indeed, I have sat dejectedly on the far end of a log after fishing the hole under it in vain, and seen the mighty R wade downstream close behind me, adjust that comical extra butt, and jerk a couple of half-pound trout from under the very log on which I was sitting. His device on this occasion, as I well remember, was to pass his hook just once through the middle of a big worm, let the worm sink to the bottom, and crawl along it at his leisure. The trout could not resist. Once, and once only, have I come near equaling R's record, and the way he beat me then is the justification for a whole philosophy of worm fishing. We were on this very Taylor Brook, and at 5 in the afternoon both baskets were 2/3 full. By count, I had just one more fish than he. It was raining hard. "You fish down through the alders," said R. magnanimously. "I'll cut across and wait for you at the sawmill. I don't want to get any wetter on account of my rheumatism." This was rather barefaced kindness, for whose rheumatism was ever the worse for another hour's fishing? But I weakly accepted it. I coveted 3 or 4 good trout to top off with, that was all. So I tied on a couple of flies and began to fish the alders, wading waist deep in the rapidly rising water, down the long green tunnel under the curving boughs. The brook fairly smoked with the rain by this time, but when did one fail to get at least 3 or 4 trout out of this best half-mile of the lower brook? Yet I had no luck. I tried one fly after another, and then, as a forlorn hope, though it sometimes was a magic of its own, I combined a brown heckle for the tail fly with a twisting worm on the dropper. Not a rise. I thought of R sitting patiently in the sawmill, and I finished more conscientiously than ever. Venture as warily, use the same skill, do your best, whether winning or losing it, if you choose to play, is my principle. Even those lines which by some subtle telepathy of the trout brook murmur themselves over and over in me in the waning hours of an unlucky day, brought now no consolation. There was simply not one fish to be had to any fly in the book out of that long, drenching, darkening tunnel. At last I climbed out of the brook by the bridge. R was sitting on the fence, his neck and ears carefully turtled under his coat collar, the smoke rising and the rain dripping from the inverted bowl of his pipe. He did not seem to be worrying about his rheumatism. "What luck?" he asked. "None at all," I answered carelessly. "Sorry to keep you waiting." "That's all right," remarked R. "What do you think I've been doing? I've been fishing out of the sawmill window just to kill time. There was a patch of floating sawdust down there. Kind of unlucky place for trout, anyway. But I thought I'd put on a worm and let him crawl around a little." He opened his creel as he spoke. "But I didn't look for a pair of 'em," he added. And there, on top of his smaller fish, were as pretty a pair of 3/4-pound brook trout as were ever basketed. "I'm afraid you got pretty wet," said I. "I don't mind that," I replied, and I didn't. What I minded was the thought of an hour's game waiting in that roaring stream, whipping it with fly after fly, while R, the foreordained fisherman, was sitting comfortably in a sawmill and derricking that pair of 3/4-pounders in through the window. I had ventured more warily than he, and used, if not the same skill, at least the best skill at my command. My conscience was clear, but so was his, and he had had the drier skin and the greater magnanimity, and the biggest fish besides. There is much to be said, in a world like ours, for taking the world as you find it, and for fishing with a worm. One's memory of such fishing, however agreeable they may be, are not to be identified with a defense of the practice. Yet, after all, the most effective defense of worm fishing is the concrete recollection of some brook that could be fished best or only in that way, or the image of a particular trout that yielded to the temptation of an angleworm, after you had flicked fly after fly over him in vain. Indeed, half the zest of brook fishing is in your campaign for individuals, as the Salvation Army workers say, not merely for a basketful of fish qua fish, but for a series of individual trout, which your instinct tells you ought to lurk under that log or be hovering in that ripple. How to get him by some sportsmanlike process is the question. If he will rise to some fly in your book, few fishermen will deny that the fly is the more pleasurable weapon. Dainty, luring, beautiful toy, light as thistledown, falling where you will it to fall, holding when the leader tightens and sings like the string of a violin. The artificial fly represents the poetry of angling. Given the gleam of early morning on some wide water, a heavy trout breaking the surface as he curves and plunges, with the fly holding well, with the right sort of rod in your fingers, and the right man in the other end of the canoe, and you perceive how easy is that Emersonian trick of making the pomp of emperors ridiculous. But angling's honest prose, as represented by the lowly worm, has also its exalted moments. "The last fish I caught was with a worm," says the honest Walton, and so say I. It was the last evening of last August. The dusk was settling deep upon a tiny meadow, scarcely 10 rods from end to end. The rank bog grass, already drenched with dew, bent over the narrow, deep little brook so closely that it could not be fished except with a double-shotted, baited hook, dropped delicately between the heads of the long grasses. Underneath this canopy, the trout were feeding, taking the hook with a straight downward tug as they made for the hidden bank. It was already twilight when I began, and before I reached the black belt of woods that separated the meadow from the lake, the swift darkness of the north country made it impossible to see the hook. A short half-hour's fishing only, and behold, nearly 20 good trout derricked into a basket until then sadly empty. Your rigorous fly fisherman would have passed that grass-hidden brook in disdain, but it proved a treasure for the humble. Here indeed there was no question of individually minded fish, but simply a neglected brook, full of trout which could be reached with the baited hook only. In more open brook fishing, it is always a fascinating problem to decide how to fish a favorite pool or ripple.